Good afternoon. I'm Olha. I'm glad to welcome you to the Media Center Ukraine. Today we are going to present a research to you. This is about reprivatization in Russia and the removal of is going to return to Russia, and our research of reprivatization says that it is not as fast and as simple. Not because the Westerners do not want this, but over the last years, the Russian authorities have created some conditions that actually prevent them from returning to Russia. It's not about consumer market, but about some huge companies. It is not reprivatization or deprivatization. It is expropriation or confiscation even. And of course, according to the law, there should be compensation for all this. However, generally speaking, it is only the Russian authorities that decide which assets return, which not, and everything that's going there is in the interests of the authorities and in the interests of filling the budget of Russia. The worse the situation with the Russian budget is, the quicker the processes are. In 2022-23, it was 1 trillion rubles, and it's 5 times as much in 2024. And this is before the announcement of the huge privatization, which was announced something like 2 weeks ago. And we think that this process will gain in scope. The rhetorics of even the president of the Russian Federation is changing. The Congress of Russian Entrepreneurs, which is the biggest association of the oligarchs, he said that nationalization was not going to be of mass nature. Within less than a year, he has changed his tune and says that nationalization will go on until all the aims are achieved. We have broken the process into several stages. It hasn't been happening from 2022. It started before, but 2022 allowed to organize the procedures that are being applied. The processes themselves started in 2019-2020. It only gained in scope in 2022, and in fact, the authorities gave a signal to complete the process. We often hear from mirror-like reactions when foreign companies started to get away from Russia, but we think that it's not the case. It was the attempt on the Russian side to try to make Western companies to perform their social obligations and also to get some compensation. The practices are gaining in scope. The military-industrial complex is spread into other branches, and we also see the change in the framework of nationalization. If previously the major aspect was provision for the military-industrial complex. Now they pay rather more attention to logistics. The Federal Security Service is involved, and the Federal Service of Technical and Export Control as well. So the directions are rather conditional. They started from the branch direction, which was about the military-industrial complex, and they spread to agro-traders, to logistics, and some enterprises that are not connected to the military-industrial complex at all. They say that if you're not able to provide for the state's needs in the required scope, then you should forget about your assets. As far as the occupied territories, Ukrainian occupied territories are concerned, we see that after the initial stage of active confiscation and privatization of Ukrainian property and assets, now it is stolen. And then the confiscation of Russians who are opposed to the regime and live abroad. We now see that they have spread this approach to everyone who lives abroad. Any Russian citizen may become an object. So now the scope of this reprivatization is 3 trillion rubles, and they are spreading and deepening the process. Instead of making contract with the business or agreement with the business, they started to apply subordination and subjugation of the business. We're not going to list all the reasons for the initiation of nationalization, but some of them are really ridiculous. For instance, the prosecutor's office says that this or that person was in favor of Western interests, and also there are some companies from UAE, from Saudi Arabia, from the UK and the US who were confiscated, whose enterprises were confiscated. Why this does not promote the return of foreign companies? If the enterprise is defined as a strategic enterprise, it can be confiscated. Then, of course, when people do not pay, or companies do not pay taxes or move their money abroad, any foreign company can be charged with this, and then they suffer. And in fact, there are no other reasons except the decision made by one person. They try to keep now the Chelyabinsk metallurgic combine. They have bought the shares on the exchange and nationalized this metallurgical combine. Again, if they started with the military-industrial complex, now they spread to any other sphere as well, and the law norms are being set up on the precedent basis. And you can see from the photos that there are no new owners. Traditionally, this has been a circle of people who are close to Mr. Putin. We see that Chemezov from Rostech got the most, and the structure of Boris and Arkady Rotenberg, Roshim. The only difference between them is in the form of getting the new assets. Rostech, however, got their new assets based on decrees by Putin, while Roshim has bought all their assets. And we think that the reason is that most of those assets are oriented to the export, so that they do not have any problems with courts abroad. And then most of the assets that Rostech has got are not linked to the military-industrial complex, while Chemezov got most of what is connected to the military-industrial complex. Rosatom, Sergei Kiriyenko, has got quite a lot. However, you see the diversity of those assets, and it looks like the completion of the formation of their production lines. Also, the family of the Patrushevs, also less assets were transferred to VTB Bank of Andrei Kostin, and also less assets got Mr. Sechin. However, we have to remember that he's got control of Action Model and British Petroleum. It's something like $4 billion, only the assets of those companies. We don't see, however, some assets which were transferred to them in the last, during the latest time. There's a fall in the number of assets given to Kadyrov. In 2024 and 2025, we haven't seen anything that was transferred to Kadyrov. We also added this slide. We heard that Ariston is coming back to Russia, and the meaning of this return is that they want to show that the refrigerators are coming back to Russians. However, this is not the Ariston that produces refrigerators or laundry machines. This is another company which actually has not left the Russian market. They have never put their assets for sale. And another reason is that the structures of Gazprom, who got their assets according to Putin's decree, those structures are also undergoing some changes, and maybe they just are getting rid from fallible assets. So this is a signal we are inviting you. You haven't seen Mr. Kovalchuk in the list. He has got quite a lot. He got his assets by way of sending the letter to Mr. Putin and asking to get control of the scientific and research institutions. And he got, in 2023, some institutions connected to the military-industrial complex. Mikhail Kovalchuk is the head of the Kurchatov Institute. And they started to join to themselves the Oceanography Institute in Gelendzhik, for instance. In 2024, most of he asked for is being transferred to him, and some people are still resistant, but we don't think that this is for long. So to sum it up, we think that this will restrain foreign investors from coming back to Russia, because we see that a closed economic system is emerging. The enterprises that left Russia have dealt with the loss of their assets and debts, and they do not want to come back and to risk the same. Internal limitations and the rules that were enacted by Russian law, the precedents, for instance, Domodedovo airport was confiscated because they have an owner who lives in the United Arab Emirates, and then the native fields and agro trader was confiscated by because their owner also has the right of residence at some foreign island. So we think that there's a key factor of the fear of cooperation with foreign business. No one will try to do this because they are risking to lose everything the next day. And then the Russian forces are actually adding some reasons like support for the armed forces of Ukraine or some foreign services, which shows that you can be imprisoned any day now. All this process that we can conditionally call nationalization, is it happening by way of later sale to someone at the top of the Kremlin authorities, or is there still a share of state property, state asset in this, whereby the state would control this enterprise? Well, first of all, the prosecutor's office initiates the process, and the enterprises are transferred to the state, to Rosimущество, and some of this remains in the ownership of the state, and some of it is being sold. It is mostly small assets. And then again, there are different ways. Some of them are being privatized by way of issuing decrees from Putin or the government. Some of them are actually being sold. Especially small assets are being sold in order to fill the budget. Vadym, how does this process influence the top of the Kremlin authority? To continue what Olha said, I'd like to start with mentioning the March of 2024 after the presidential elections in the Russian Empire Federation. This was not only the election of the lifelong emperor, but there was a new story in the relations between Putin and the top elite of the Russian Federation. The elections became kind of a summing up of the previous period when there was an agreement between Putin and elites, but we can say now that they are now gone and forgotten. And this pertains to the oligarchs who have never played the political role. They were like waiters, or those who actually gave money and opportunities to Putin and not interfere with the politics. On the other hand, it's about the nearest, closest circle around Putin, and this was reflected in the first decree that was issued by Putin about Mr. Patrushev, who was removed from the position of the chairman of the National Security Council. However, Patrushev retained some of his opportunities and capabilities, but from that moment the rules of the game actually ceased to exist. Before that, they were like a concrete foundation of the Putin regime. Almost 13 months have passed since then, but the new rules have not been written. They're being written while the game is developing. And the rules of reprivatizations are so numerous that one can understand that at any moment for any differing view, you can be deprived of your assets and everything at all. As far as the system of governance in the Russian Federation concerned, starting from the end of 2023, we can notice that the system of Kremlin towers is changes. There was a system of Kremlin towers for quite some time. The structures that were the people who were allies, according to some common interests, and they were able to approach Putin directly and influence both internal and foreign policy. And due to discussions between Kremlin towers, they were solving some of the issues. But the towers of Kremlin have been moved to a step lower, and there's another circle of something like 20 people around Putin. We call them Putin's guardsmen, and they are the people who have to provide to secure the main national idea of the Russian Federation, which is Putin will live as long as possible and as comfortable as possible, and he has to die as late as possible. Everything that corresponds to these goals corresponds to the interests of the Russian Federation. And of course, there are some people who are close to Putin and some who are within this circle because of their positions, like the mayor of Moscow or the head of the government, the Minister for Defense. Belousov does not play any significant role in the political system of the country, but because he holds this position, he is within this number of guardsmen of Putin. If we talk about who are the most ardent followers of continuation of the war, we see the Apocalypse 5, Chemizov, head of Rostech, Patrushev, the person who, in spite of all, has retained enormous influence within the system coordinates of Mr. Putin, Kiriyenko, who is responsible for the internal policy of Russia. He was given Abkhazia, and I think that he wants to enter Ukrainian field as well. Kovalchuk brothers, whose one of the main functions is the research of gerontology issues and continuation of life, and their main task is probably telling Putin that he can live until he is 120. Ushakov, who is an advisor on foreign policy, and he is really responsible for the entire foreign policy of the Russian Federation, and those people, bar Ushakov, are people who are heavily engaged in economics, and they are among those who get the most from this reprivatization in the Russian Federation. We have not listed Rothenberg here because we do not consider him a person who really seriously influences the domestic and foreign policy of Russian Federation, but he's gaining in activity, and let's pay attention to his sports activity in this, because he's doing everything possible in order to allow to play soccer or hockey with the national team of the United States. So he's the person who is responsible for organizing this game, We remember how important this was for the Soviet Union. Putin remembers this, and this is what actually Rothenberg is trying to do. He understands that if he brings a soccer or hockey team for a match in Russia, he may enter the circle of Putin's guardsmen. Why is Putin afraid of the end of the war? First, he thinks that the summer military campaign is possible to be effective, and he wants to improve his position. Someone has told him that Kyiv within 3 days can be repeated and be successful in this time. Another important point: Russia is not prepared to switch to peace. Let's look at our sociology, and we see that something like 30 to 35% of Russians are the so-called patriots who demand the continuation of war and who demand more blood. Surprising as this may be, some of them are not pro-Putin, and they think that Putin is actually the traitor to the Russian cause, and they may become a active minority who during the peacetime can become a factor of destabilizing the situation in Russia. Putin does not understand what to do with this 30 to 35%. Kirienko does not understand this as well. And traditionally, you should stall and bide your time if you do not understand how and what to do. So they have to stall in order to disperse the situation, dissolve the situation with those 35%. This is one of Putin's strategies, and we should not forget that one of the calculations of Mr. Putin is that he thinks that the longer he bides his time, the easier for him would be to be a mediator between Trump and Xi Jinping, US and China. And of course, there's a very important point: the proposal on rare earth minerals between the USA and Russia, which actually became more active. Talks about it became more active after the statement that Trump has made to the NBC, and Putin thinks that the Russian Federation will be able to press for the solution and decision that the American companies will not only be able to come back to Russia, but he thinks also that some trading houses will be able to work in non-friendly countries of Europe and be able to sell something to China. So Putin is staking on Stalin, and he is not prepared to stop combat at all. About the logics of the elites, quite controversially, I'm going to say that we should understand that as of today, in spite of the fact the topic of Putin's heir is actually banned in the Russian society, but some of them are trying and starting to think in terms of living without Putin. This or that way, they understand that sooner or later the life will be without Putin. And of course, much depends on how they will feel after Putin. The logics of living without Putin, it does not mean that they are preparing a coup d'etat. It's rather about creation of alliances and the system of checks and balances after Putin. By the way, they are all of more or less same age, and they hope that Putin will go away before they die. About the pairs that play key roles in post-Putin thinking. First of all, we have to understand that Chemezov-Patrushev pair and also Mantrov, the first vice prime minister, is there, has not disappeared. Who was Patrushev at the moment of his removal from power? He was the curator of all the law forces and armed forces, and Chemezov is head of Rostech, which was responsible for all the technology for the war. Of course, Patrushev's influence has dwindled, but he still plays a very crucial role. Will they remain alive? Those who remember who studied Russia remember the head of Russian Railways, Yakunin, who for some time was regarded as a possible heir to Putin. However, at one moment of time, he became sick and died. So they're living within the logics of to die the last and to win the race after Putin. So this pair, Chemezov-Patrushev, is the strongest now. They have a very powerful financial resource. And of course, if anyone is capable of coup d'etat, they have to watch them, although I once more say that they do not think about coup d'etat. The Federal State Security Service is sort of a two-headed eagle. They have now two managers, two commanders, which was created, the situation was created by Mr. Putin because he does implement the rule divide et impera. He was afraid of FSB becoming stronger, so he actually created this structure when they have two commanders who report to him according to their own responsibility, spheres of responsibility, and this fragments the opportunities and capabilities of SB in post-Putin race. And we should understand that FSB may become part of someone else's game, but not play their own. Regrettably, Putin will not die tomorrow. We practically do not have this option, but the FSB is living as a two-headed eagle, as a divided structure, which of course diminishes their possibilities, but it also diminishes the probability of coup d'etat. Kadyrov, of course, is preoccupied with retaining power in Chechnya, and he should be regarded as part of the pair with Zolotov, who commands the Russian Guards. Zolotov is not the person who may be number one, and they can play only an auxiliary role for some other players. The army in Russia is not an independent body. We do not see any general, as a person who could be an independent player. In this respect, Belousov has played a very important role because he removed some tension around figures like Shoigu. Kiriyenko should not be underestimated. He controls at least half of the governors in the Russian Federation. We see that he is actively involved in the work in the occupied territories and recruits some very important actors from there. But the major problem of Kirienko is that he does not have army or law enforcers on his side, under his control. He will be playing auxiliary role as well. Mishustin and Sobyanin have the biggest chances, the highest chances of becoming Putin's heirs. Several months ago, we asked in a sociological survey who is going to be Putin's successor, and we see that the level of trust in Mishustin was very surprising for Russia, 25% and 10% for Sobyanin. And of course, they are playing the game, the compromise leader. They will not play any additional role. Thank you for this research, very interesting. Friends, if you have comments or questions, we can give you the mic. And I have the question about the removal of sanctions. Regrettably, this topic is more and more noticeable in the mass media. In mass media, will this lead to any return of huge businesses to Russia? We actually think in terms of different markets. First of all, consumer market, like cosmetics and clothes and all this. And the second point is investment business. I would be surprised if this returns to Russia. As far as retail is concerned, oh yes, they will be returning because this is a huge market and the risks are not going to lose much if they return. And of course the sanctions are very different and they not depend on the US, which is very important. What does Putin offer in case of the removal of US sanctions? He says, I offer a high risk, high margin business, and of course there's a pool of companies in the world who are prepared to do this if they have some political guarantees, if they understand that the US or anyone else guarantees some level of security for them. But if this does happen, then we think that this will be a certain pool of companies who are prepared to risk in order to get the margin of 50 to 100% of profit. But the mass return of production of manufacturers or technologies in Russia into Russia is impossible. The Russians do not have enough money. They have technological degradation. And the removal of sanctions in Russia is possible only in the case that if the sanctions are removed, then technologies come to back. So far, we do not see anything like this. Friends, if you have any questions, please tell me so. Thank you for your very important research. And of course, I want to thank our armed forces for giving us the opportunity to gather here. No questions. I would like to add that in principle, this research is published on the site of Delova Stolitsa. You can read it. Thank you very much. Meet you again. Glory to Ukraine.